This is not a story about a misunderstanding or a bad night. It is a clinical dissection of a predator's pattern, a case file marked by calculated cruelty and, for one victim, a chilling proximity to death. In Oklahoma, two high school girls, identified in court documents as LS and KS, were subjected to a terror that spanned nearly a year, an escalating campaign of violence and control executed by a respected local athlete, Mack Butler. The allegations against him were not isolated incidents but a systemic pattern of abuse that eventually led to a stack of 11 criminal counts. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The initial charges filed in Payne County District Court included first-degree rape, attempted rape in the first degree, sexual battery, forcible oral sodomy, and, critically, multiple counts of domestic assault and battery by strangulation. It is the charge of strangulation that rips this case from the realm of sexual assault and places it perilously close to homicide. According to medical professionals and the victim's own testimony, during one attack, the act of strangulation was so aggressive, so sustained, that KS was about 30 seconds from death. The victim's own statement to the court contained the harrowing detail. 30 more seconds and this would not be my statement. It would be my mother's because I would not have survived. I survived what he did, but I will never be the same. Butler was not merely accused of assault. He was accused of nearly taking a life, and then threatening to eliminate the victim's family should she ever disclose his actions. The explicit details laid out in the affidavit painted a picture of calculated domination. One account described Butler's chilling words to a victim who repeatedly yelled no and tried to push him off. He reportedly told her he was sorry for what he had to do, but he had to do it. In another instance, when the victim pleaded to leave, Butler responded, "You're not going until I'm finished." For KS, the constant abuse forced her into a state of hypervigilance, where she stated she learned what to do and not to do to avoid being hurt by Butler. The affidavit further detailed that when Butler would pin her down and render her physically helpless, the sight of her hyperventilating was something he thought was funny. The charges span multiple incidents over roughly a 7 to 8 month period, demonstrating an escalating pattern of violence that culminated in charges filed in March of 2025. The case, State of Oklahoma versus Mack Butler, CF 2025-59, was formally filed in the Payne County District Court. An arrest warrant was issued with a bond set at $25,000, a figure many found shockingly low given the severity of the 11 felony counts he faced, each carrying significant prison time. Butler was, in fact, taken into custody on March 4, 2025, with body cam footage capturing his mother's presence during the arrest, treating him with a casual leniency that would later become a flashpoint for public anger. He posted a surety bond the same day, immediately imposing special bond conditions that prohibited all contact with the victims. Initially, 2 attorneys were involved in his defense, Royce Hobbs making the initial appearance where Butler entered a plea of not guilty to all charges on March 6, 2025, followed shortly by Derek Chance entering his appearance as lead counsel. The collective potential sentence for the 11 felony counts, including multiple counts of rape, attempted rape, and strangulation, was calculated to be nearly 78 years in prison. This was the shadow under which the prosecution began, a figure that represented decades of accountability for the young man who had systematically brutalized his girlfriends. This was the expectation of the community, the demand of the victims' families, and the potential consequence of the charges. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. However, the legal proceedings soon took a sharp and unexpected turn, not towards a trial to determine guilt, but toward a negotiation that would fundamentally reclassify the very nature of the crime. Despite being charged as an adult from the outset, the defense had a powerful legal tool at its disposal: the Youthful Offender Act. This act, designed to rehabilitate certain juvenile offenders, became the leverage point in a case where the brutality suggested nothing less than adult prosecution. This legal maneuver, which began subtly with motions and countermotions, was the first indication that the victims and the public might be fundamentally misled about the path to justice in this case. The DA's office, while proceeding with the adult charges, was simultaneously navigating the discretionary provisions of Oklahoma law that permitted the eventual compromise: a denial of full juvenile treatment, but the granting of the controversial youthful offender status. The victims' families, who had endured the trauma of the attacks and the exhaustive process of reporting them, now faced the unsettling prospect of their assailant being viewed not as a criminal facing the maximum sentence, but as a young man needing rehabilitation. This shift in classification was the precursor to a legal development that would ultimately shatter the family's faith in the Oklahoma justice system. The immense potential sentence, the 78-year shadow, was about to be evaporated by a single seismic ruling in the Payne County courtroom. Despite the mountain of evidence, the near-homicide charges, and the potential 78-year sentence, the legal process was secretly positioning Butler for a path of clemency. How could the court justify classifying a predator facing 11 felony counts as merely a youthful offender? And what was the immediate, explosive reaction of the two victims and their families when they learned the final deal would include 0 days in prison? For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The legal system's concession arrived on August 25, 2025, in a development that blindsided the community and devastated the victims' families. Jesse Mack Butler appeared before the court and entered a no-contest plea to all 11 felony counts. This plea, legally an admission that the prosecution could prove the charges without admitting personal guilt, was the foundation for the sentence that followed. Butler was formally granted youthful offender status and sentenced to probation, mandatory therapy, and community service. The 78-year prison shadow that loomed over him simply vanished. This was the moment the victims, LS and KS, and their families realized the systemic failure. The punishment, mandatory therapy and probation until his 19th birthday, was seen as laughably inadequate given the charges, particularly the domestic assault and battery by strangulation, which a doctor confirmed came within seconds of being a murder. The parents' outrage was immediate and became the emotional core of the ensuing public backlash. Speaking to the media, the mother of one victim said with raw clarity, "Community service and counseling doesn't equate to what he did to her." The father, driven by a desperate need to protect others, focused on public safety, stating, "I'm just hoping that his name will be out there, that somebody will know that he's capable of this and just anything we can do to prevent other harm." They felt the justice system had been weaponized to protect the perpetrator while forcing the victims to repeatedly prove their trauma. A mother of one of the victims told Coco that her daughter had to prove she was the victim over and over again, while the system made excuse after excuse for the person who hurt her. The outrage was immediately channeled into a legal challenge centered on the Oklahoma State Constitution and victims' rights. The families, through their attorney Rachel Bussett, filed a powerful motion to vacate the plea agreement, arguing that their constitutional rights under Marsy's law had been egregiously violated. Marsy's law, codified as Article 2, Section 34 of the Oklahoma Constitution, guarantees victims certain absolute rights, including the right to reasonable notice, the right to confer with prosecutors, the right to be heard at critical stages, and the right to be treated with fairness, dignity, and respect. The motion alleged that the victims were not given meaningful or timely notice or consultation regarding the state's agreement to the Youthful Offender certification or the no-contest plea. The victims learned the true terms of the non-custodial disposition only immediately before going into court, a notice period described as approximately 10 minutes. This 11th-hour notification, the motion argued, rendered their right to be heard effectively meaningless, as the deal was already locked in or made behind closed doors. Furthermore, the families had been actively misled on the court's role in the process. The motion explicitly stated that the DA, who retained the sole authority to file the charge as an adult, either misunderstood or misled the victim on the court's authority to reverse certify Butler as a youthful offender. The victims were led to believe the power lay with the court, when in fact, the initial decision to maintain the adult charges and subsequently enter into a plea agreement was squarely within the DA's discretion. This violation of the right to confer and be informed formed the basis of the motion to set aside the plea and reset the matter for adult prosecution. The district attorney's office, led by Laura Austin Thomas, issued a public defense, acknowledging the gravity of the crimes but claiming they had consulted the families throughout the process. In their statement, they argued the severity of the potential sentence and the nature of the evidence, including the fact that the allegations were only reported after the dating relationships ended, impacted the evidence available for prosecution and the potential defenses. The DA's office claimed they had advised them from the beginning that this matter would likely end up as a youthful offender prosecution and could even end up in juvenile court. This created two irreconcilable narratives: the victims claiming a sudden, non-consulted betrayal, and the state claiming a consistent, forewarned process. The court filings confirmed the stark disparity between the crime and the punishment, which was now seen not as justice, but as a crisis of fairness rooted in a procedural violation. The legal community and the public watched as the victim's attorney pushed for a radical remedy, vacating a final judgment because the voice of the victim, enshrined in the state constitution, had been muffled. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The family's fight to vacate the plea hinges on a constitutional test. Did 10 minutes of notice violate a victim's constitutional right to meaningful consultation? Furthermore, as the legal battle unfolded, explosive allegations began to emerge concerning Butler's privileged background and whether it played an unseen role in the unprecedented leniency he received. The fight to overturn the probation sentence transcended the procedural violations of Marsy's law. It pointed a stark finger at the potential influence of privilege on the administration of justice. Jesse Mack Butler was identified in media reports and by victim advocates as the son of a prominent local family, specifically the son of a longtime Oklahoma State University football director. This detail, while not a formal part of the criminal charges, fueled the widespread belief that this prominence created a two-tiered system: a sweetheart deal for the well-connected and a profound disappointment for the victims. The outrage was so acute that State Representative J.J. Humphrey, Lane, publicly called the outcome unacceptable and announced plans to file a petition for a grand jury investigation into how the Payne County prosecutors handled the case. Humphrey explicitly accused local officials of showing favoritism and contrasted Butler's case with others that had resulted in far harsher penalties for similar crimes. The community's response was sustained and highly visible. Protesters gathered outside the Payne County Courthouse during Butler's compliance hearing on December 8, 2025, demanding accountability and criticizing Judge Worthington's decision. This public pressure was a direct result of the perceived leniency and the suspicion that Butler's social standing played a key role in the application of the Oklahoma Youthful Offender Act. The legal complexity lay in the statutory framework itself, which became the thematic focus of the third argument in the motion to vacate. The attorney representing KS argued that the law created a legislative loophole allowing dangerous discretion. Specifically, under Oklahoma law, a minor aged 15 to 17 who commits first-degree murder is almost universally charged as an adult, the so-called straight-to-jail provision, and there is no statutory avenue for reverse certification, reducing the charge to youthful offender status for murder. Yet, the same statute allows for discretion in charges of first-degree rape, domestic abuse by strangulation, and forcible sodomy. The motion argued that the gravity of Butler's multiple, escalating crimes, including the nearly fatal strangulation, should have been treated similarly to murder, effectively making it unsuitable for reverse certification. The legal team contended that because the state charged Butler as an adult initially, it was the DA's moral, if not absolute legal, duty to maintain that prosecution path, especially given the victim's vehement objection to the leniency. The court's acceptance of the plea agreement was directly contrary to the victim's consent, which they vehemently disagreed with and objected to before the court. The resulting sentence mandated that Butler's youthful offender rehabilitation plan be supervised by the Office of Juvenile Affairs, OJA. This plan included an aggressive schedule of therapy with a specialist in sex offender treatment, and the court maintained jurisdiction until Butler's 19th birthday. The critical condition of this deal, as reported by the DA's office, was a looming 10-year sentence in adult prison should Butler fail to successfully complete his rehabilitation plan and be reclassified as an adult. The victim's motion sought to exploit this condition by requesting the court to require the defendant to allocate, meaning to formally acknowledge or admit to the facts of what he did, as a condition of his continued status, a requirement absent from his no-contest plea. The legal filings sought to use the OJA's supervised status as an opening to compel a confession of the facts, or risk reclassification. The motion further sought to modify the existing conditions to include permanent protective orders for the victims, a step deemed necessary to restore public safety and give effect to the victim's fundamental right to reasonable protection from the accused. This part of the legal challenge highlighted the systemic risk. An individual who nearly murdered a victim via strangulation and whose conduct was deemed an escalating pattern of violence over approximately 11 separate incidents, was free in the community under terms that offered minimal long-term assurance of public safety, fueling the victim's fear of future reoffense. The legal framework for violent sexual assault had allowed a rapist to walk free. The victim's attorney, facing the DA's staunch public defense of their consultation process, had now lodged a final, two-pronged attack to force a corrective action: a new sentencing hearing and modification of the terms. What were the specific, non-negotiable modifications the victim's attorney demanded, and what was the official legal outcome of the motion filed to set aside the plea deal? For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. Facing a deeply entrenched system, the victim's attorney, Rachel Bussett, launched a dual-statute legal strategy to force a corrective hearing, not only citing Marsy's law, a constitutional provision, but also the Oklahoma Victims' Rights Act, a statutory provision, to argue that her client was entitled to relief. The goal was no longer merely to register a complaint, but to enforce the rights that had been violated during the plea and sentencing process. The motion was explicit in its demanded corrective action: a new fully compliant hearing where the victim could be genuinely heard, followed by a modification of conditions and terms necessary to restore fairness, protect public safety, and give full effect to the victim's rights. The specific remedies sought by the victim's counsel were highly practical and focused on safety: modification of existing conditions, imposing additional supervision requirements on Butler, no contact orders, formalizing and strengthening the prohibition of any contact, unsealing the victim's protection order, making the order public and enforceable, ordering a permanent victim's protective order, establishing long-term court-mandated distance and protection. A corrective hearing, a formal resentencing hearing where the victim's input, interview, and full impact statement could be officially heard and considered before a final judgment. The motion argued that there was nothing in the statute that prevented the court from reconsidering its acceptance of a plea agreement before final judgment or sentencing, or vacating or modifying an unexecuted sentence in order to remedy ongoing violations. The entire legal effort was an attempt to prove that a victim's constitutional rights, when violated, could trigger an action capable of altering the trajectory of a criminal defendant's life, even post-sentencing. Crucially, the district attorney's office continued to defend its actions, emphasizing that they had advised the families that the circumstances of the case, specifically the age of the parties, all 16 at the time of the alleged crimes, and the nature of the allegations occurring during consecutive dating relationships, impacted the evidence and available defenses. The DA's statement pointed out that this advice, given at length on multiple occasions, was intended to manage expectations, warning that a youthful offender prosecution was the most likely outcome. This solidified the core factual dispute. The DA believed their protracted communications constituted meaningful consultation, while the victims' families felt the last-minute delivery of the plea deal terms rendered all prior conversations irrelevant. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. Despite the compelling constitutional arguments and the evidence of near-fatal strangulation, the legal consensus among experts consulted by the media was sobering. The likelihood of the court completely vacating the plea and throwing out the entire sentence to reset the matter for adult prosecution was deemed low. This was rooted in the fundamental structure of the criminal justice system. The state, represented by the DA, has the ultimate prosecutorial authority, and victim rights are generally confined to notice and participation, not veto power over the disposition. However, legal experts acknowledged that a corrective hearing and the modification of conditions, specifically imposing mandatory protective orders and additional scrutiny, were realistic possibilities given the egregious nature of the rights violation and the violence demonstrated. The ultimate remedy, therefore, was unlikely to be sending Butler to prison, but forcing the system to enforce the victim's right to safety and respect by strengthening the non-custodial sentence. The case, regardless of its outcome, had already served as a catalyst. It thrust Oklahoma's Youthful Offender Act into the national spotlight, forcing a conversation about why the law allows discretion for violent sexual assault and attempted strangulation while removing it for murder. The victim's courageous fight, driven by the desire to prevent future harm, transcended the personal trauma and became a landmark challenge to the legislative and judicial processes in the state. The final judgment of the court on the motion would determine not only the future conditions of Mack Butler's probation, but the precedent for how every victim in Oklahoma would be treated in the face of a controversial plea agreement. The outcome of the motion would determine the power of Marsy's law. Even if the court does not send Butler to prison, the case has already achieved its true, lasting impact, forcing a public reckoning with the Oklahoma statute and ensuring the names LS and KS, the victims, are forever linked to the push for reform, demonstrating that even a flawed system can be forced to listen. And as always, you've been watching True Crime Story Vault, where every case is examined with facts, clarity, and respect for the people affected. If you want to see more fact-based true crime stories like this one, make sure you subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.